Anubis intimidated everyone he crossed paths with, and it was immediately clear why he was far from an ordinary dog, a fact the vet realized the instant Anubis and his owner David stepped inside without hesitation. The vet contacted the police. Meanwhile, David sat in the waiting room completely oblivious to what was unfolding, but the police were about to make him regret ever buying this dog. David's first instinct was to get his dog Anubis and make a run for it. He still did not understand why the vet had called the police, but he did not want to risk his beloved dog getting taken away from him. It was already too late for that. Before he managed to make his way out of the vet's office, the police had already arrived, and there was nowhere David could go. Now he did not want to just give up Anubis to them without a fight, but when they started to explain themselves, David's demeanor changed. Everything suddenly became clear. Anubis was no ordinary dog. How had I overlooked this for such a long time? But why had the vet contacted the police about David and Anubis? What was wrong with the dog, and could David accept giving him up? David hadn't planned on buying a dog that day, but the moment he locked eyes with Anubis, he couldn't look away. The look lasted only a moment before the strange dog with its yellowish eyes and sharply pointed ears shifted his attention back toward the wall of the pen. David found himself moving closer, even though he actually felt slightly afraid of the dog. There was just something about him. David knew he was taking the dog home for two reasons. The first was that he had already mentally named the big black dog Anubis. The second was that the guy selling the dogs in the corner of the farmer's market didn't look like he cared for the animals particularly well. The dog David was specifically interested in had only come in yesterday. The seller grunted something about how everyone else thought the dog looked too mean, and said he would probably end up getting handed over to animal control to be put down if no one bought him. Hearing that news, David knew he couldn't leave the dog behind. Part of him feared that the man who seemed less than trustworthy would charge a price that David couldn't afford. Thankfully, this wasn't the case. The seller just seemed eager to get rid of the strange dog in his gut. David knew that he should probably first discuss bringing a dog into the house with his wife Monica, particularly when it was such a dangerous-looking dog, and the fact that he and Monica had a set of 4-year-old twins who knew how this eerie black beast would react to children. Time was running short as the seller was beginning to pack up for the day. David couldn't bear the idea of Anubis being sent to a shelter and killed. So he made a decision. David knew his wife well enough to predict she would refuse this dog if he asked her without consulting her. David paid the sketchy seller and guided the unusually quiet and obedient Anubis to his truck throughout the entire drive home. The peculiar dog remained calm, silently gazing out of the window. It was only upon arriving home that David realized he hadn't heard a single sound from Anubis. David had never seen a dog behave like this before. Had Anubis perhaps undergone some training in his previous life? Perhaps he'd been a police or military dog who had failed to make the cut. This kind of composure couldn't be normal, right? David could feel the angry stare of his wife Monica coming through the window when he stepped onto the porch with Anubis. Luckily, his 2 sons, Melvin and Marty, reached the door sooner than she did. David held his breath, tightening his grip on the leash. Would Anubis suddenly become aggressive? Monica hurried up behind the twins, her fear unmistakable. Anubis, however, remained unbothered and handling everything with an eerie calm despite his intimidating look. Melvin and Marty were overjoyed, jumping around and declaring that Anubis was the coolest-looking dog they had ever seen. While the dog maintained his serene demeanor, Monica found it hard to stay angry. But Monica was actually very mad. How could he have made such a decision without asking her? What had he been thinking, bringing home a dog like that out of nowhere to be around their children? Why would he buy a dog from a random man at a farmer's market? Once Monica had said everything she needed to say, David apologized for not talking to her. Then he explained the whole situation. Once she heard about how Anubis would have been on his way to a kill shelter, if not for David, Monica's anger lessened. She admitted that despite her first impression she did quite like Anubis. She just worried about having him around the twins, who could be quite boisterous. And Lau David agreed that supervising the twins whenever they were around Anubis would be a good idea for a while, but Anubis would end up deterring a lot more than potential burglars. Much to David and Monica's relief, Anubis quickly proved himself to be a perfectly capable family dog. Nothing seemed to bother him, and as a bonus, his intimidating demeanor also made him a very good guard dog. While Monica and David found this a bit uncomfortable, it again did not seem to bother Anubis at all. When either David or Monica would walk, Anubis through the park, other dog owners, joggers, or just anybody present would give them a wide berth, trying to keep a safe distance. Anubis had been living with David, Monica, and the twins for nearly a month, and his stoic, violent nature hadn't changed since day one. David couldn't help but feel uneasy about how the dog seemed almost entirely devoid of emotion. Nothing seemed to upset him, nor did anything excite him. The appointment was booked for 3 days later, in the time before the appointment. David decided to do some research of his own. David ended up booking an appointment at the vet to get Anubis thoroughly checked out. But this simple checkup would turn into an ordeal that David could never have predicted. He was still unsure, even about what kind of breed the dog actually was, let alone what might be wrong with him. David had some ideas, but none seemed to completely match. Probably only the vet could help him find out the truth about Anubis. After several hours of research, the twins really wanted to come with David and Anubis to the vet, as they thought they could help keep him calm, but David decided to leave them home just in case there was actually something wrong with the dog. David didn't want his children to feel uneasy about it. Besides, Anubis clearly didn't need anyone's help to stay calm. David was certain that not even the cold, intimidating atmosphere of the vet's office could unsettle this dog. However, it would soon prove to be far more terrifying for David than he could have ever imagined. When he arrived at the vet that afternoon, it was very busy in the waiting room. Some appointments before him had taken a lot longer than was anticipated, and there had even been an emergency situation today. So David and Anubis had to wait a while, and they were getting a lot of looks. Some people put their pets back in their cages or grabbed a tighter hold of the leash. It was clear to David that they were afraid of his dog. This was something he, of course, was used to by now, but it was the first time it would actually come back to bite him. Sorry for the interruption. Before we continue with the story, I kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to this channel. It is very important for us. Thank you very much. An employee of the vet office walked up to David, and with a bit of shame clearly on her face, she asked David if he and Anubis could wait outside for their appointment. Some of the other people in the waiting room had complained about feeling unsafe. David looked down at the ever-so-calm Anubis and took a deep breath of disappointment. This dog would not hurt a fly unprovoked, and David knew it, but he would probably forever be mistrusted just because of the way he looked. The other people in the waiting room avoided making eye contact with David, even though he wasn't happy about it. He took Anubis outside to wait for their appointment. David could never have predicted the consequences of this at the time. After being outside for only a couple of minutes, a man in a long coat walked past the pair, but halted in his step. When he glanced at Anubis, the man asked David if the dog belonged to him, and when David confirmed, he knelt down beside the intimidating black creature. Unlike most people who encountered Anubis, this man appeared entirely unfazed by the dog's fearsome appearance. He explained that he was the senior veterinarian just coming back from his break. He was in a rush for the next appointment. But something about Anubis motivated him to stop for a moment. He did not want to elaborate on what exactly had caught his attention, but he promised David that he would speed up his appointment if he allowed him to switch to his care instead. Instead of the vet David had originally booked. With the man seemed strangely eager about this, David found it odd, but since it was fairly cold outside and he had no idea how much longer they would have to wait for the original appointment, he agreed. The senior vet walked into the building satisfied, and David was called in just 10 minutes later. He felt the angry stares of other people in the waiting room, who obviously realized that he had been allowed to cut in line before them, but he did not care. These people in their pathetic prejudice could suck it, as far as he was concerned. David led Anubis into the office where the senior vet was already waiting, dressed in full protective gear. He looked more like he was preparing for surgery than conducting a simple consultation. While David was explaining to the vet what was worrying him about Anubis and why he had come for help, the vet seemed preoccupied with checking the dog up and down. He barely even listened to what David was saying. Halfway through the conversation, the vet suddenly interrupted David and told him that he needed to take care of something quickly. He marched through a side door of the office, closing it behind him and leaving a baffled David in the room. David could hear some talking on the other side of the door, but he could not make out what was being said. The conversation lasted only about 2 minutes, and when it stopped, David expected the vet to return any second, but he didn't. David waited and waited until nearly 15 minutes had passed. He was growing impatient and had no idea what was going on when he tried the door handle. He found it was locked. He started knocking on the door, then banging, calling for anyone to come and get him, when no one responded. David's frustration began to boil over. Why were they treating him this way? Could it have something to do with Anubis? Overcome with anger, David's vision blurred with fury. In a sudden burst of rage, he kicked the door open. The vet stood calmly in the adjacent room, unfazed by the door being kicked open. David, frustrated and alarmed, demanded an explanation. After briefly checking his watch, the vet finally addressed him. He informed David that he had contacted the police about him and Anubis, and that they could arrive at any moment. David was stunned. He demanded to know why, but the vet told him that the police would do a better job of explaining than he could. David was still full of adrenaline from kicking in the door. In his mind, the police were probably going to take Anubis away from him, and he wasn't going to let that happen. With Anubis following close behind, David sprinted to the other door of the room and tried to leave the building as quickly as possible, but it was already too late. The police were outside the building and stopped him in his tracks. It was clear that they wanted the leash to take Anubis away, as they had an animal control vehicle with them, but David was not going to give Anubis up without a fight. He stood in front of Anubis and screamed that if they wanted the dog, they would have to go through him while this was happening. One of the police officers slowly stepped forward, making calming gestures with his hands. The officer explained that the senior vet had identified Anubis after confirming the dog's identity. During the examination, the vet had contacted the police to report his discovery. The officer revealed that the dog David had bought from the shady seller was not just any ordinary Mexican hairless dog. Anubis was actually owned by a religious leader in Mexico City, nationally known for preaching the words and culture of the Aztecs. The officer explained that this breed of dog is very important in Aztec culture. Legends say that such dogs guide the dead to the underworld, a hellish prospect for any religious mortal. The religious leader used Anubis, whose actual name was Zolo, to calm grieving relatives during funerals. Zolo would sit by the leader's side, unmoved by death and the ceremony, symbolizing that God was not interested in taking the deceased soul to the underworld. Zolo's calm demeanor was the result of specialized training. A few months ago, Zolo had been stolen by non-believers. The dog was thought to have been put down, but he had somehow ended up with the shady seller. David had bought him from David, was shocked by this revelation. Suddenly all his lingering questions about Anubis made sense. He realized he had to let the dog go so Anubis could return to his rightful owner and continue making a difference in people's lives. Even so, it was difficult for David to say goodbye to Anubis. In the end, he gave Zolo up, and the dog was returned to his owner in Mexico. The religious leader, a wealthy man, gave David a handsome reward for his role in returning. Zolo David and his family later adopted a new dog, ensuring it came with the proper paperwork and that all family members approved the decision. Did you enjoy this story? Would you have also left Anubis to its rightful owner, as James did? Let us know in the comments below. If you liked the story, subscribe to this channel and leave a like from time to time. James still thinks about Anubis. Thanks so much for listening. See you in the next video. Have a great day.